What's going on, everybody? This is Afro Think Tank. This is going to be a long, very educational video. And it's probably going to blow your mind a few words that are uttered by this European ally. You hear me saying with all the confidence in the world, European ally. Do you remember that movie? Now, I can't remember the quote, but it's a very famous movie with a very famous scene where someone was having a lecture when a bunch of intellectuals was on the stage. And one of the actors, Dumb and Dumber, right? With Jim Carrey and the other guy, right? The one who played the other guy. He played, I guess he was a politician or something. And somebody asked, when was America great? And then the guy got up and said, America was never great. And he gave this epic speech that nobody can refute. Even though it was a movie, every word that he said was true, right? Now, there are many white Europeans who are like that, right? They are fully educated and aware of what their people have done in the past. They are fully aware of their role as them being a white European is in the economics of today. And with all that being said, they are still allies. And believe it or not, this is going to sound wild coming from me. This is going to sound wild coming from me. I've been asked this question. And me as a Pan-African, I feel like I can also give the wrong answer to this question. And if I give a certain answer to this question, I can look like a sellout. But I'm being a realist because I live in the real world. And I do know, just like I know for a fact that every black person that comes from Africa that look like me does not have my best interest at hand. And they mean to do everything to tear us down as black people. As we see, there are plenty of social media personalities who have displayed that exact attitude. And there are, in fact, white supremacists in blackface. There's just the opposite on the white side, where there are white people who are more pro-black than the blackest person in your blackest community. And this is one of those white guys who he actually comes out his own lips, his little thin European lips, and comes out his mouth to say with all confidence in front of the world that he is in fact a Pan-African. And he is not the first white person I've heard say he is a Pan-African. And there's another white guy from Washington, D.C. that also says he is a Pan-African. And they don't just say Pan-African as if just to be saying it. They actually mean it in their actions. The economic, social, and business actions push towards unapologetic Pan-African and support towards African people with no actual benefit to themselves as European, white, heterosexual male men. Do you understand? So without further ado, I want you to listen to this lecture and understand that Africa is the future. There's no doubt about it. This guy is he's a scientist in what he does. He is a foremost expert in global economics. He's just as intelligent and has the wherewithal as Richard Wolff, who I presented you before with the other presentation. So without further ado, please pay attention to this excellent lecture, which you're going to get. You're going to hear this white European Pan-African tell you how Africa is the future and how China and Africa together are going to be the future of the multipolar power unit, power world, in the center of the power on this planet. Anyway, that's all I got to say. It's Afro Think Tank. Learn something, teach something. I'm out.
We are at a major hinge moment in the world. I think everybody knows this. Everybody feels it worldwide. We can thank Donald Trump for clarifying how weird the world is. We gave you the weirdest possible president of the United States just to underscore with an exclamation point. This is a different world from the world of the past. It is a world in which the United States is fading not only from rationality, but from its dominance of the last 75 years. It's a world in which China, of course, has become a larger economy than the United States, a more dynamic economy, a more technologically sophisticated economy, actually, even though on conventional data, the GDP per capita of China is still only around 1/3 of the US level. The fact is, China's actually more advanced than the United States in many areas of infrastructure, of research, and of the 21st century technologies. And so this is the new economics that we are facing. I brought up my computer because I wanted to read you something to explain the kind of weirdness of U.S. policy to help you understand a little bit of what is going on in this U.S.-China war that traps all the rest of the world somehow in between the two giant economies. And if you'll permit me, I just wanted to read you one thing that was written 10 years ago that helps to explain where we are. Oops. So I spoke this morning just before coming here on a Zoom to Beijing, which was a U.S.-China roundtable to discuss why is there so much tension. And everyone was saying that, well, the two sides are in a war with each other and trade war and so forth, and we need to tamp down the tensions. And I said it's not exactly like that. What is happening is the U.S. is having a temper tantrum, basically. It's not a war between the U.S. and China. It is the U.S. absolutely having a tantrum because China's become so successful. This is quite different from two sides fighting each other. This is one side acting like a 4-year-old, and we've now elected a president who fits the role perfectly. But let me read to you, thank you. Let me read to you a very interesting article if you want kind of illumination of the American mindset. It was an article written 10 years ago for the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the establishment institution in New York, about U.S.-China relations. And I recommend people to read it. It's by Blackwell and Tellis, Robert Blackwell and Ashley Tellis. And it's called Revising, let me give you the exact name, Revising U.S. Grand Strategy Towards China, published in March, I think it's March 2015. And I'll just read you a few excerpts, and then it will help you understand the geopolitics. It helps me understand the geopolitics entirely. So this is 2015. Blackwell, who was my colleague at Harvard, after he was at Harvard, went to become one of America's leading diplomats. He was ambassador to India and a very senior official in the United States. So what he says is rather authoritative here. It's not an academic speculation. It's an announcement about U.S. policy. And he says, since its founding, the United States has consistently pursued a grand strategy focused on acquiring and maintaining preeminent power over various rivals, first on the North American continent, then in the Western Hemisphere, and finally globally. Because, and then now I'm skipping, because the American effort to integrate China into the liberal international order has now generated new threats to U.S. primacy in Asia and could eventually result in a consequential challenge to American power globally, Washington needs a new grand strategy toward China that centers on balancing the rise of Chinese power rather than continuing to assist its ascendancy. In other words, China's become big. We're number one. We better stop that. Very simply put. Going on, the meteoric growth of the Chinese economy, even as China's per capita income remains behind that of the United States in the near future, has already provided Beijing with the resources necessary to challenge the security of both its Asian neighbors and Washington's influence in Asia with dangerous consequences. Of all nations, and in most conceivable scenarios, China is and will remain the most significant competitor to the United States for decades to come. China's rise thus far has already bred geopolitical, military, economic, and ideological challenges to U.S. power, U.S. allies, and even the U.S.-dominated international order. Its continued, even if uneven, success in the future would further undermine U.S. national interests. Okay, this is, you could call it grim realism, which is China is succeeding, that's bad. That's the American attitude. Not that China's doing anything pernicious or evil, it's just successful.
Good.
And if you're number one and the guy behind you is gaining on you or overtaking you, and your mindset isn't how you're doing, but how you're doing relative to someone else, that is seen as dangerous. That's the American mindset. And what I like about this obnoxious article, because I just want to make clear, I find it completely obnoxious, but very accurate, I would say, is that America's goal is dominance, stated clearly. So if another country is rising or powerful or a pure competitor, that's per se bad. Now, as an economist, this is completely against everything I was trained and I've thought about for my entire career, which is that economic well-being is not a zero-sum struggle. So if one part of the world is better off, that doesn't diminish the rest of the world. In fact, the most formative document of economic ideas of the modern world, which will celebrate its 250th anniversary next year, is Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It's actually a very good book, by the way. It's got a couple of flaws, which we could mention in discussion, but it's a book of pure genius and humanism also. But his basic idea is the world helps each other. Different parts of the world trade with each other. This is mutually beneficial, not the American mindset. Mutually beneficial. And so a larger world market is good for everybody. And Smith had two very humane insights. One, he told the British, because he was writing, of course, in Scotland in 1776, don't fight with the Americans. Trade with them. Let them be independent. We don't need colonies. We just need free trade because that's what makes us better off. So that was one very humane idea, which, of course, King George III did not listen to. So there was a Revolutionary War that lasted for many, many years. Incidentally, the war was actually won not by George Washington. It was won by the French, who saw an opportunity to undermine their rival, Britain. Again, a very European idea, that we can hurt Britain by helping the United States. France did such a good job that they spent so much money, they went so deeply into debt that they had a revolution the next decade when their finance minister tried to raise taxes to pay off the debts that had been incurred in fighting the British in North America. But that's another story. But the point is that Smith said, let them go. We just need to trade with them. We don't need to dominate them. And the other thing that Adam Smith said quite wonderfully and very relevant for us is that he said, it's my favorite paragraphs in economics, by the way, which you can find in the middle of the Wealth of Nations. He says that the two most significant events in the history of mankind are the voyages of Columbus, or he says the discovery of the sea routes to the Americas and to Asia from Europe. So the voyages of Christopher Columbus in 1492 and of Vasco da Gama in 1498. And he says, in a very humane way again, these events united the whole world. And in fact, united the world for the first time of 10,000 years, because 10,000 years ago, the world was united over a land bridge between Asia and the Americas, which went underwater when the Ice Age ended and the sea level rose. So Beringia became the Bering Straits rather than a land bridge. And so the world was divided between the old world and the new world, and then came these voyages. And Smith says this should have benefited everybody, because each part of the world could help to meet the needs of other parts of the world, so we should have mutual benefit. And then he says, but it happened that European military superiority was so vast that these meetings of the different parts of the world rendered devastation on the East and West Indies, the natives of the East and West Indies, he writes in 1776. And then he says, but someday there will be a rebalancing of power in the world. And that will come about through trade, because trade will spread ideas and allow the regions that are now under the domination of European rule to rise in power and reestablish an international justice based on an equality of force. So he wrote that 249 years ago. We're in that world now. We're actually literally international trade, because that was the mechanism of China's rise, is leading to the rebalancing of power. Okay, if you put these pieces together, basically what Blackwell and Tellis wrote in 2015 is the tail end of Adam Smith's story. It's a rebellion. It's a reaction of the last redoubt of Western imperialism against the rise of the rest of the world. And that's the period that we're in right now. We're in a reactionary period, and Trump is the ultimate reactionary president. In a literal sense, make America great again. What does that mean? It means let's return to the world of 1950, when America was the most powerful and white part of the world. So it's a racial reaction, and it is a global power reaction. It's doomed to fail. We just don't want it to destroy anything else in the meantime. It can't succeed because Adam Smith is fundamentally correct in his 1776 insight that the world will rebalance over time. And the world has rebalanced. And also in the United States, to understand Donald Trump, understand that American demography has changed decisively. We were about 88% white and almost entirely European in 1950. Now the United States is, by the U.S. Census definition, white means white non-Hispanic. So all of this place knows more about race than any place on the whole planet, and classifications and all the weirdness and so on. But in the U.S., white means that you're not Hispanic, or people of color of various sorts, from African American, Asian American, and so on. And that white non-Hispanic category, which was about 88% of the population, is now 55% of the population. And it will be less than 50% by the 2040s. So Trump is the last reactionary response to that. He is literally created by Obama's presidency, because he is the reaction to Obama. And Mamdani is the reaction to Trump. And And by the way, Mamdani and Obama are the future of the country, just in a pure demographic sense. And so Trump is not the end of the story, but he is the weirdest part of the story we ever had. That's absolutely for sure. So where we are geopolitically is that the world is rebalancing, but especially what has happened is Asia's rise. And Asia has many different parts to it. And it's very interesting to attend to the different parts of Asia. And I won't do a long excursus about this, except to say that it's such a fascinating story because, of course, Asia is about 60% of the world population. So it's a lot of human history. But when European imperialism dominated Africa and Asia in the 19th century, one country in Asia uh, escaped colonial rule in either a direct or indirect way. It nearly fell under colonial rule, but escaped it, and that was Japan. And it's a fascinating story, but Japan reacted to the arrival of American imperialism, actually, with the U.S. Navy showing up in Tokyo Bay in the 1850s by having a decisive, I call it a capitalist revolution, in 1868 called the Meiji Restoration. And they said, we got to get our act together, otherwise we're going to fall under the sway of these Western barbarians. And they did get their act together in the most remarkable way. And one of the things they did, which is one of my favorite stories of economic history, is they didn't have the internet then. Connectivity was weak. So they established a commission in 1868 to tour the world to find out what were the best practices of the most powerful countries, called the Iwakura Commission. And it went off to the world and came back with 18 volumes of observations about Europe and the United States and what to do. And they made radical reforms in the early 1870s, and that propelled the first industrialization of Asia. And they got so good at it that by 1895, they became an imperial power. So it was something in the mindset. It's actually also an incredible story. In 1894, Japan invaded China, and a Chinese diplomat said to his Japanese counterpart, "Why are you invading us? We're being attacked by the barbarians from the West, and you're attacking us." And the Japanese diplomat responded, "Oh, sorry, we have joined their club." Uh, that's a literal quotation from a wonderful book by Ezra Vogel about China and Japan facing history. And the Japanese became Western imperialists, wannabes, and invaded China repeatedly up until 1945 and colonized Taiwan and Korea and so forth. Anyway, back to our current events. This Asia dynamism started with Japan. Japan then became the imperial power of East Asia. It launched World War II in Asia, of course. And it was, they were absolutely brutal, by the way, stunningly brutal, with 10 to 20 million Chinese dying during World War II, a story very few people know, and I certainly did not know in detail until reading a wonderful book this year by a Harvard professor named Rana Mitter called The Forgotten Ally, about what happened to China during World War II and how completely devastating that war was. But in any event, after World War II, Japan almost immediately recovered within a 15-year period because the United States rebuilt Japan with a lot of Japanese effort, of course, but rebuilt Japan to be a bulwark against communism in East Asia. So the U.S. gave an extra hand. So that started the Asian recovery after World War II. Then came all the countries that followed Japan's example how to grow rapidly, because Japan invented a rapid growth strategy, first in the 1870s, and then they did it again after World War II. And it's a mix of state and market. It is state-guided market growth. And if it sounds familiar in China, it's because China learned it from Japan. Actually, China learned it truly from Singapore, which had learned it from Japan. So first came Japanese growth, then came the so-called Asian tigers, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Then Deng Xiaoping came to power in China in 1978, had a long conversation with Lee Kuan Yew when he visited Singapore, and implemented the Singapore model, I would say, which was the Japanese model, and implemented it so well that 1.4 billion people became a high-income, technologically dynamic rival of the United States within a 40-year period. And the next step of this is India, which is about 20 years behind China chronologically in the development. India looked over at China, said, what the hell's going on? We have to reform. And India began its reforms in the 1990s, opening up to the world, ending what they called the license Raj, which was a completely bureaucratic, mixed up system, opened up to large entrepreneurship, and starting in the early 2000s began rapid economic growth as well. And then two other regions that I would mention in Asia. One is Central Asia, which reached its pinnacle of economic influence in the year 1400, when the Silk Road was the dominant transit between Europe and Asia. But after Vasco da Gama, the great cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, and others fell into museum status in a way, because their role in East-West trade was ended by the Suez Canal and by the Cape of Good Hope first, and then the Suez Canal in the late 19th century. But now Central Asia is saying we're back again because overland transport is actually quite efficient and much faster than the sea routes. And China's really good at fast rail. And so Central Asia is also experiencing a proto-boom, I would say, as the East-West connector. So this is still to be formed and to be solidified, but the so-called five stands of Central Asia, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan are in the middle between Europe and Asia and are regaining their historic ancient role as a land bridge between East and West, and that's propelling a lot of growth. And then the last major region of Asia to mention, of course, is the Middle East and especially the oil-rich Gulf. And this is a very rich region facing the quite complex challenge of global energy transformation when the livelihood has been hydrocarbons. But it's a rich part of the world, obviously, the entire Gulf region. So Asia is in a very dynamic state. It will remain so no matter what the United States does. And in this sense, it's not true to say that globalization has ended or the world is fragmented. There was the old saying of the British Empire that there's fog in the channel, the continent is isolated. That the center of the world was London, If there was any division, it meant that the rest was isolated. I'd say that's basically the right description today, that the United States is becoming more and more protectionist and isolated and having a tantrum with China especially, but basically a tantrum that the age of U.S. dominance, which lasted about a half a century from 1950 to 2000, is diminishing and disappearing, in fact. And the idea that this means the end of globalization is completely wrong, because Asia by itself is 60% of the world population. Africa right now is 18% of the world population. And Africa and Asia are not fragmenting and isolating. Africa is in the process of creating the African Continental Free Trade Area and strengthening its relations with Asia in trade. And so what is fragmenting is the U.S. European role, which was dominant for 2 centuries between 1800 and 2000 and is no longer dominant in the world. So we're going to have a discussion, and I'm going to close by saying the change of geopolitics is real. It comes from a fundamentally good point, which is that Adam Smith's prediction that there would be a rebalancing of the world is coming to be. The fragmentation is mainly the US and Europe really having an existential crisis. You could call it a neurotic breakdown from the fact that several hundred years of dominance is coming to an end. And this is very hard to grapple with because the mindsets are very deep. And they're deep in Europe and the US. And anyway, everything the US knows about bad behavior it learned from the British, who were our tutors all along and taught everything about imperial behavior to the United States. We're just kids on the block compared to Britain in this regard. But this part of this age is coming to an end. The question, of course, on all of our minds is what about Africa's position in all of this? Africa has not had the kind of dynamic, sustained, high growth that Asia has experienced. And we can discuss some of the reasons for that. But the real question is, will Africa follow this path of rapid growth over the next 40 years? My answer is yes. My assignment to you is to make it happen, because there is a unique role of leading universities to make it happen. This is a knowledge-led world, no question. And the knowledge is in the universities first and foremost. And so the universities are actually the key instruments of economic development. We don't have the taxing power. We don't have the ability to implement, but the knowledge has to start here. The training of young people has to start here. The vision of what to do has to start here. The knowledge technically of how to implement has to start in the universities. My view is that the next 40 years should be a period of 8 to 10% per year growth of Africa, roughly twice the current rate, and that this is feasible, and that China is the proof of concept and the best role model as well for how to get this done. And by role model, I don't mean exactly the political formation. China's political system doesn't date from 1949. It dates from 221 BC. So China's statecraft is centralized administrative statecraft ushered in by Qin Shi Huangdi in 221 BC and implemented and refined by the Han Dynasty from 204 BC to 220 AD. So don't try to replicate that exactly. That is on the basis of a lot of practice for 2,000 years. Each place needs its own political culture. But what China has done is show how to plan, how to think forward, how to implement long-term infrastructure strategies, how to dramatically raise the human capital in the population over 2 generations to make the cutting-edge, high-tech country right now, leading in most areas, in fact. And if you look, by the way, at the most innovative clusters in the world, Silicon Valley is number 3 on the UN WIPO list. Number 1 is southern China, the so-called Greater Bay Area of Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. Number 2 is the Tokyo-Yokohama corridor. Number 3 is Silicon Valley. Number 4 is Beijing. Number 5 is Seoul. So this is an Asian phenomenon, very successful, but China figured out how to do that. Africa needs to do this in the next 40 years. And Africa is going to be 25% of the world population by 2050, and it's going to be 35% of the world population by 2100. So please get this right. You're going to be at the very center of the world. And you all know it, but I need to say it all the time, and let me just end here. It is, of course, always pointed out, Africa has the youngest population. It's got a burgeoning young labor force. This is called the demographic dividend. It's not true, stated that way. What will make this a demographic dividend is if that is a highly educated young population. Otherwise, believe me, it will be a huge burden for young people and for society and for the world. What is needed here is, above all, is investment in education. And not next year, 10 years, 20 years, but now, that every child is in school, online, with a device so that they can participate in the digital learning and digital economy, and that they're going to complete at least upper secondary education. But I hope that many of them come to Gibbs also, so that they can learn entrepreneurship at the cutting edge. And please work all over Africa for this, because this is a continental scale that's needed. You're the third of the mega populations. China, India, Africa, all are 1.5 billion people. You'll be much bigger than China and India soon enough. But 1.5 billion peoples, that's a big market to work for. That is all the gains of scale within the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I hope that a very strong university network in Africa, of course, linked to partners with the rest of the world, but especially within Africa, can propel this unprecedented scaling up of quality education, knowledge, and technology across the continent. Thank you very much.
Free Sudan! Boycott diamonds and gold! Free Sudan! Boycott diamonds and gold! We most definitely cannot forget about the people of Sudan.
Thanks for watching Afro Think Tank. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And follow me on Substack and Patreon for more content. Remember, it's Pan-Africanism or nothing.